Hello and welcome back. This is the second part of our PHP video where we saw how to dockerize a static PHP website, in that case with no database. So in this part of the video we are going to see how to dockerize a PHP website with a MySQL database, and we are going to make very good use of Dockercompose, which will help us run multiple containers as one application. All right, so basically I'm using the same simple PHP website, but this should be the same even when you're running a complex website, so no need to worry. So I've already initiated my local server here, so I should be able to access this application on port 8000. So let us just check. Right, so I'll have that and that. Right, so this is the front-end code that you are seeing, and the database connection has been done here. Right, so the very first thing that we mentioned you need to check is if Docker is already installed on your machine. Also in this case we need Dockercompose, so you need to confirm that Dockercompose is also installed. In case you don't have Dockercompose installed on your machine, I have attached the installation link in the video description. Once we do that, the next thing that we need to do is to create a Dockerfile. So we are going to create two files besides our code. So in here I need to create Dockerfile, and remember the naming convention should be maintained. So we have Dockerfile starting with a capital D. All right, then we're also going to need Dockercompose, docker-compose.yml. All right, so these are the two files that we are going to need besides our project file. So in the Dockerfile, so the first thing that we need to do, which cuts across all Docker images that are duplicated, is to mention the base image. Right, in this case we are going to use a different tag other than what we had used before. All right, so we are going to start with from, then base image. So in this case I'm going to work with PHP, and the tag is I'm working with version 8.1, and I'm going to use Apache. All right, then the next thing, in this case we need to install some required dependencies because they are required in the connection that will be established between our web application and the database. So we are talking of install dependencies, right? So we need to do the run command, then we have docker php ext install MySQL. Right, so that's the command that we are going to use. So the next thing is to copy the source code files to the container. Right, so let's talk of just copying files. So remember previously we first declared the working directory, all right, which we can still do in this video, but the best practices, especially when trying to minimize the size of the image, is to skip the unnecessary layers. Right, so usually the work dir command, this is the command that I'm talking about, the work directory command. This is usually meant to create this path or the directories if they do not exist. Right, but in Apache I have this path created. All right, so we do not need to create it again. All right, so instead of having this layer, we know that it already exists, so all we need to do is to copy our files from the current directory to this path here. Right, so once we do that, we can then expose our port 80. All right, so once we are done creating the Dockerfile, and this should actually be MySQLi. Once we are done creating the Docker file, the next thing should be creating the docker-compose.yml file. Alright, so this is the basically the code that will help us run 2 containers under one application. Alright, so the first thing in a docker-compose.yml file, the first thing is usually declaring the version, and in here we are going to work with version 3.3, right? Then once we do that, we require to mention the services, right? And in this case we are going to have 2 services. Then another crucial thing that we need to have is volumes. We are going to mention the volumes down there, and we are also going to mention the networks. All right, so we are going to work on these sections one by one. So starting with service, we have 2 services that we are going to work with, and at least you need to add some indentation. So I'll use tab to create that indentation. And the 2 services that I have, I'll give them names. So the first name, I'll name it PHP Apache, and have the rest of the code down here. Then the next service will be MySQL, right? Then have the code for that down here. So back to the initial service, right? I'll give a space, then indent 1 space inside. Right, so what I need to mention here is that this is the service for our web application here, and of course it's going to use this Docker file that we have created here. So ensure that you have this in place, right? So what we need to have is that we are going to give a command to build, and the build will be happening in the current path. So we denote that by that full stop, saying that our Docker file is in the current directory. Right, so once we do that, the next thing we do is to work with the ports, and we want to expose the internal port to the outside world, and the internal port is the port that we exposed here. So we are going to have expose or to map the internal port 80 to port 8000. So that is what we start with. Then the internal port 80. All right, then so ensure to observe the indentation. So in here we need to move back 1 step so that we can be in the same line with the ports and build. All right, so the next thing that we need to mention is volumes. So the volume section, this is where we want to anything that changes within the container should also happen here, and vice versa. By here I mean in the local directory. All right, so all I need to mention is the local path. All right, and then mention the working directory. So in this case the working directory is here. All right, so mention that there. Remember, when deploying this application to say some VPS somewhere, many other times you'll need to upload this code here, right? So this path will be existing on that virtual machine. So the next thing that we need to mention is for this web application to do what it's supposed to do, it depends with the availability of the database, right? So we need to mention depends on tag in there and mention the name of the database. So we have named our database MySQL, so let's mention that name here, because for these to display the correct items, to display the correct data, it depends on the availability of this service here. So ensure to mention MySQL or whichever name that you have given it here. All right, So the next thing, ensure to observe the indentation. The next thing that we're gonna mention is the network. So the network, by mentioning the network here, it should be the same network that we mentioned for MySQL. This is to enable communication between the two containers. Right? So we are going to give a network name here, and we can simply call it app network. All right, and in that point we are done with the configuration of our first service. All right, so for MySQL, in here we need to do some indentation, then mention the image. Right, so the image, we are going to make use of MySQL with version 8.0. right? Then from here we need to set the environment variables. So we need quite a number. So most of these variables, I believe we can be able to fetch them from Docker Hub. MySQL, just fetch them here. Right, so we need this. Actually for now I don't need that, so we need that. All right, we are going to give the value shortly. Then we also need to mention MySQL database. Right, then the next thing, we also need a user and a password. All right, so we basically don't need the rest of the stuff. So these are the 4 credentials that we need. All right, so for the root password, we can simply have root password, no harm, or the password of your choice. Then for my database, then we can make use of the database details that we have here. Remember, if we use any other credentials here, be sure to update them here. All right, so that's the database name. Then we have that as a user as well. Then for the password, let me just copy what we have here. All right, so the next thing, we also need to mention the ports. The ports for our MySQL container, we usually map port 3306. So the next thing that we need to mention, the volumes. And in this case, for the volumes, we can mention of MySQL data. Right, so that's a volume that will be created in our local machine. Right, and it's mapping MySQL volume where actual data files are stored. That is in the var lib MySQL. Then once we do that, the next thing that we need to mention is the networks. All right, so the networks, we mentioned that for them to establish a connection, we need to give them the same name. All right, they need to be under the same network name. Right, so we are also done with the MySQL service. The next section is to mention the volumes that we have in place, and the volumes that needs to be created are just MySQL data. Remember, the reason why we are not creating this volume is because this volume already exists, because it exists in the current directory where we have our code. All right, so for the MySQL, this volume does not exist until we create it. All right, because we are basically mapping the default volume. This is the location where the database files are stored within the container, and it should map that to our local machine. Right, so that's why we need to declare that here, so that this volume can be created and made ready for use. Right, so for the network, let us also mention the app. All right, I need to give an indent, so I need to mention app network. Alright, so also you need to do that, and that is how it should be. So basically a network name with this, the given name will be created, and that is what these services will use to communicate with each other. Alright, so once we have done that, the next thing is to run one command that will run this container. Alright, so we basically have two containers, so let us see. So all we need to do is to have docker compose, then we have app, and we can mention build, so that we get a build of those containers. Press enter. Right, then we are told that port 306 is in use. So as I mentioned, you can change what you have here, or ensure that the application running on this port uses a different port, or it's actually not running. So in my case, the reason why this is in use is because I have MySQL service up and running, right? And remember, this application, our application here, is making use of that database, and because we want this application to make use of the new database that is to be created here, then I can stop that service first. So all I need to do is sudo systemctl stop MySQL, right? Right, so MySQL should be down. Let me check on the status. Right, you see that it's inactive. Then if we come here, try to reload, so it's not even able to connect to the database. So let us try now to run the command to start our docker compose. Right, build, that's what we need. Starting, something else is in use, port 8000 is in use. We already have the application running here, so let me stop the server. Right, remember it was running on port 8000, so let us stop that, come back here and run that command. Right, okay, perfect. So in your case, it might take a bit of time trying to maybe pull MySQL 8.1 if at all it's not there and all that, but in my case, I already have this image in my machine, so it was pretty fast. Right, so once we do that, reload. Right, so the database connection has not been established. Right, so we need to make some slight adjustment. Right, so in our DB connection here we have localhost, so there is no service with this name that is recognized in that environment, so we need to use this service name, right? MySQL. Just change this and have MySQL, save and save that. So in this case, if you save the changes here, they do not automatically reflect, so you must stop this server and restart it again. So I'm going to restart it by docker compose app build. Let me just clear the screen. Right, so I'll run this command. Alright, once I do that, let me come here, reload, and we see that a connection has been established. Right, so in case you are in a production environment and you do not want to see these logs, let us terminate that. If we check can't be reached, come back here, rerun that, then add -d. Once you have that, then let's come back here, retry, and we see that we are able to access it. Even if you are to terminate editor, our containers will still be up and running. Again, if this machine was to turn off then back again, these containers will not come back up. Reason being, we have not instructed them to restart whenever such a need arises. So all we need to do is to add restart command here, and we are supposed to mention restart always. All right, and that is on the both services. All right, Otherwise, if the machine was to be restarted or turned off and on again, you need to restart these containers. Otherwise, if this has been set in place, then they should start automatically, right? So once you have that, you can try and rebuild, right? Then you can inspect the images if at all they are up and running, and you confirm they are up and running. So that should be it. In case you want to turn them off, you want to stop them and destroy them, you can use the same command, docker-compose, but this time we talk of down. Pull them down, right? Then if you check docker-ps, you don't see any containers up and running. If then you come back here and check, your website is no longer there. That's simply how to use docker-compose on PHP and MySQL database, and I hope this video was helpful. Kindly be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and see you in future videos. Bye for now.